Today I'm down in Southern California braving the rain to drive the new 2022 Hyundai IONIQ 5. For me at least, this is one of the most exciting new electric vehicles in the world for 2022. Because not only is this the start of a new IONIQ sub-brand for Hyundai that's going to include the IONIQ 6, a 4-door sedan, and the IONIQ 7, a 3-row crossover, but because this is one of the first 800-volt EVs in the world. Like the latest electric vehicles from Audi and Porsche, this Hyundai will support 800-volt DC fast charging. That means it is going to charge considerably faster than the vast majority of EVs around the world. This will go from 10% to 80% charge, basically accept a 70% charge in 18 minutes. This is one of the fastest charging electric vehicles that you can buy for 2022. On the outside, the IONIQ 5 doesn't really look like any other Hyundai sold in America right now. That's because Hyundai recently decided that they didn't need to make all their vehicles look like scale versions of one another. Instead, each vehicle in their lineup is going to have some unique styling cues, and pretty much every styling cue on the IONIQ 5 is very unique. This looks very modern, but also has a hint of retro in it, with, for instance, these very square accents on the full LED headlights. Full LED headlights are standard, but the base model gets a different design. The two top-end trims, SEL and Limited, get the projector headlights that we see in this model. At the bottom of the bumper, we have active grille shutters, and a really cool design touch is that this silver strip that goes from one side right onto the other actually has little illuminated slashes in it to give this a very distinctive look up front. In pictures, the IONIQ 5 doesn't look as big as it is. This is about an inch wider than a Hyundai Tucson, and at 182.5 inches long, it's on the long side for the compact crossover segment, but definitely a little bit shorter than something like the Hyundai Santa Fe. These wheels are 20-inch wheels, and this wheelbase, the distance between the front wheels and the back wheels, is 118.1 inches long. That is longer than the 3-row Hyundai Palisade. And that makes sense because this platform, again, is going to spawn a larger sedan and, of course, a 3-row crossover in the future. From some angles, the IONIQ 5 comes across as a slightly more angular, slightly more modern Volkswagen GTI. I don't think that's a problem at all, but I think as a result, some folks assume that this is smaller than it really is. In addition to these wheels being large in diameter, they're also pretty wide. This has 255 width tires, front and rear. That's definitely wide for a mainstream EV. Something like the Mach-E, that comes standard with 225 width tires. The top-end tire is only a 245. We also don't have as much black body cladding here as we find on some competitive electric vehicles or small crossovers. Instead, Hyundai has gone for a silver accent here with some interesting hashes to give it sort of a circular theme, just like we see on the wheel. Now, I have to say, black wheels are not exactly my thing. All models have full LED taillight modules. The turn signals are red, which is not my preference. I kind of wish that in this design, Hyundai had given us an amber turn signal. Now, this module is fixed to the body. The inner module right here, that is part of the hatch. The hatch itself is a bit more raked than we find in some mainstream crossovers that aren't electric, but it definitely is a bit more upright and a bit more practical than what we see in the Mustang Mach-E. As with most Hyundais on sale for 2022, the IONIQ 5 is going to have a ton of driver assistance tech standard. Adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitoring, rear cross-traffic detection, the rear parking sensors, lane keeping assistance, driver attention monitoring, autonomous braking with pedestrian, cyclist, and junction detection. Those are all going to be standard on every IONIQ 5 model. If you want all the features, that'll be on the Limited trim that has things like the 360-degree camera, front parking sense, assisted automated parking, and the more aggressive lane keeping assistance system with automated lane changing. In the United States, Hyundai has decided to give us just the larger battery pack that's going to be available around the world in the IONIQ 5. So range figures will vary depending on where you're buying the IONIQ. In the United States, this is going to be a 77.4 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack, and it's a skateboard-style pack right underneath the vehicle. Bit of breaking news, it turns out that Hyundai will actually be bringing the smaller battery pack to the United States, and with it, a less powerful electric motor. For 2022, the base model will have a 168 horsepower electric motor in the rear and a 58 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack. The range in that model is going to be 220 miles. Rather unfortunately, that announcement came after I filmed the video and drove the car, so without further ado, let's get back to what they told me when I was there. You can get your IONIQ 5 with two different motor setups. Either rear-wheel drive, 225 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. That's going to get you 303 miles of range, and it's going to be the most efficient. Or you can get the all-wheel drive variant, which is what I'm driving today. There's a separate front electric motor right here just under this small cargo storage area right there. That gives you up to 320 horsepower total. 221 in the rear, so just a little bit less in the rear, and 99 up front. A really cool engineering touch with this front electric motor is that it has a world's first for an EV. It has a mechanical disconnect for the front electric motor. Rather than relying on a different electric motor design like we see in some vehicle manufacturers that is perhaps a little bit more efficient, this will remain rear-wheel drive when all-wheel drive is not needed, and then it will mechanically disconnect the front motor from the equation in order to help improve efficiency. And that's how, depending on the drive cycle, you could get this up to 132 mpge in the city. That's going to be in the rear-wheel drive model, although the combined ratings, those are the ones you see over there on the side of your screen. Charging happens behind the power door over here on this side of the vehicle. There's an onboard 10.9 kilowatt level 2 charger that will take you from 10% to 80% charge in 6 hours and 45 minutes. DC fast charge rates will vary depending on the kind of station you have access to. If you connect this to a 150 kW DC fast charge station, you can get a 70% charge from 10% to 80% in 25 minutes. If you have access to a 350 kW station, then you could do that in 18 minutes, making this the fastest charging EV on the market right now, according to Hyundai. According to the engineers, under the right conditions, this could gain 68 miles of range in just 5 minutes, and that's all thanks to the 800-volt charging system. When we're talking about the same amount of current, doubling the voltage doubles the amount of power that you can jam into the battery at any one moment. And that's why Porsche, Audi, General Motors, Hyundai, Kia, and a number of other vehicle manufacturers are really pushing towards the 800-volt infrastructure. What happens if you plug into an older 400-volt station? That's an excellent question. Hyundai has redesigned the rear inverter module that controls the rear electric motor to also act as a DC-DC converter. So it will accept 400 volts through that same connector, buck it up to 800 volts to charge the battery pack. There was some initial reporting that this battery pack would perhaps be split in two and would be either presented in parallel or in series to the charge station. Turns out that's not correct. Hyundai has decided to do basically what Porsche has done with the Taycan, only they're doing it in a more cost-effective manner. Instead of having a separate DC-DC converter like we have in that Porsche, where you also have to select the 50 kW version or the faster version, pay extra for that one, this is going to come with that technology standard built into the rear motor inverter. So even the base version of the IONIQ 5 will be able to charge at some faster rates at those DC fast charge stations. Over the day that I've been driving the IONIQ, I found front seat comfort to be excellent, but I do wish the driver's seat had a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Instead, Hyundai has focused a bit more on relaxation while charging. So we have a power extending Ottoman here, which is really an interesting feature for an EV like this. The front seat has a really drastic recline. The seat back can touch the rear seat back there, and then you can lift up this Ottoman even more when the seat is back and then be in a really reclined position for charging. We also have a 4-way adjustable headrest there, manual tilt telescopic steering column with the large range of motion. But you should know, front passenger seat is not identical to the driver's seat. At just over 81 inches, the combined legroom figures definitely put this in the spacious category. This is a little bit less than you'll find in a Hyundai Tucson, but right about what you'll find in a Mach-E, and definitely a few inches more than we find in the ID4. With this front seat adjuster from 6 feet tall, I have about 7 inches of legroom left or so. You could definitely put a rear-facing child seat comfortably behind me driving the vehicle, and that makes this a lot handier for families that might be considering an EV. One thing to know, however, is that even though we have a very flat load floor, this center console from the front definitely sticks out a little bit further towards the rear than I had expected it to. That means that if someone is going to be right here in the middle, they're going to have this hump right there in the middle. The main reason that Hyundai did that, you'll see in a bit, they've made that center console area very, very large, but really just usable for the front passengers. We have 2 USB charge-only ports in there, and then air vents for the rear passengers are over here on the pillars. The rear seats offer a recline function. You can put them in a very upright position to square off that cargo area, or you can give them a pretty decent recline. Behind the available power hatch, we find just over 27 cubic feet of cargo space. This does have sort of a raked profile back here, and I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity for Hyundai. I would have loved to have seen this squared off a little bit more so we could have a more practical cargo area. Again, aerodynamics are very important for any EV, and that's the reason that we find this particular profile. It's also the reason that we don't have a rear windshield wiper on this. 27.2 cubic feet puts this right in the same neighborhood as the Mach-E and the Tesla Model Y, but of course the front cargo area is a little bit smaller. Hyundai gives us a roller-style cargo cover back here. The load floor lifts up to give us access to the tire mobility kit and a little bit of additional storage. But as you can see, they have put the subwoofer kind of in an unusual place right here. If I lift this up, you can see that is the Bose and Hyundai subwoofer right there under that foam insulation. I really wish that they had placed that off into a corner and made this underfloor storage area just a little bit more usable. A lot of you have asked me, why doesn't the IONIQ 5 have a front trunk, especially since this is a dedicated EV platform? The answer is honestly very pragmatic. This hood is much shorter than the hood that we find on the Model Y or the Ford Mustang Mach-E, which both give us pretty spacious front trunks, especially the one in that Ford. But in order to put a 24-inch roller bag under here, like you can in the Ford, the front end would have to be longer. And at 182.5 inches long, Hyundai would have had to sacrifice rear cargo capacity in order to give this vehicle the same length and have a large front trunk. Quite simply, adding that extra 18 inches to the front of the vehicle is less space efficient than adding that 18 inches right back here to the rear, because for an extra 18 inches of length in the cargo area, you get an awful lot more volume. Now let's go for a quick spin around the interior. One thing that I really like about this interior is that even though we have a large sheet of glass, we have a completely opaque cover to it. So if you don't like being baked in the sun, you can do that. You don't have to worry about an aftermarket shade. We also have well-integrated side shades there for the rear passengers, four-way adjustable ratchet-style headrests, height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and a unique interior design. A large portion of this interior is made from recycled or recyclable materials. And as we've seen with other Hyundai vehicles, they've combined some interesting materials in the interior. So we have the imitation leather seats, fabric on the back. From here you can also see the ambient lighting right there on the rear doors. The trim on the doors sort of reminds me of marble, and then it has kind of a pattern painted right there on it. You can see that these seats offer moderate bolstering on the seat back cushion and not too much on the bottom cushion, so larger folks shouldn't have any problem with these seats. Moving over to the front, we have relatively plain styling for the modern theme here, but lots of soft touch materials. Soft touch armrest there, soft touch middle of the door, harder plastics down there around that bottle holder. Again, you can sort of see the purple glow from the ambient lighting right there around that speaker grill as well. The dashboard is pretty large and expansive. Lots of horizontal lines going on there. Big glove compartment over here, surprisingly deep actually. You could definitely fit a 12-inch tablet computer in there, perhaps even some 13 or 14-inch laptops as well. It's a very, very big storage area. Moving over to the middle part of the dashboard, we have two standard just over 12-inch screens in this very Mercedes-like pod here. This is what the key for the vehicle looks like. You can see it looks a lot like other Hyundai keys. We have buttons for the autonomous parking system, so you can park it and unpark it out of the vehicle, open the rear cargo hatch, press and hold for the horn, and then open that charge door right there. The software on the main infotainment screen should be familiar if you've been in any recent Hyundai product. Other than the skin, which is more of a white theme on this vehicle, it's very much the same as every other Hyundai vehicle. So we have some direct access here to seat heating and ventilation, steering wheel right there. We can also click back over to the front climate options there for easy direct access to that. We have a driver-only setting for a bit of increased efficiency there, and then it supports slide gestures for the temperature. The EV screen is the one that's going to be most different from other Hyundai vehicles out there. You can control things like the vehicle to load. You can basically run those loads until the battery hits 50%, or you can run the battery all the way down there to 20%. We can also click up here and get a few other options, for instance, an eco driving score. You can see that I've been driving it aggressively here, less aggressively in the morning. We can also click over here to electricity usage, and we can see where the electricity is being consumed at this moment. So at this moment, electronics are 0.39 kW, climate control is just 200 watts over there, and drivetrain is 0 because we're parked. As we find in other EVs, you can schedule charging and climate there. And if I click over to this button here, you can choose how full the battery will get when you're on a DC charger or on an AC charger. And you can also limit AC charging current if you have that particular problem where you are. Hyundai allows us to enable and disable winter mode, which is kind of an interesting touch. Winter mode basically heats the battery a little bit more for better DC fast charging performance and better vehicle performance, but your range may drop as a result. There's also a utility mode, which allows vehicle systems as well as the vehicle to load power delivery function to operate for extended periods of time, say if you just want to party in your yard or if you're camping. Below the infotainment screen, we find two large air vents, the start-stop button, some physical buttons for that infotainment system. I think that's a nice touch because Hyundai has moved to touch buttons for a lot of things, but these are still physical buttons in this row up here, but then we have some touch buttons for the climate control below. Below that, we find the completely flat load floor in here, you can see, but we have the USB port for the infotainment system here. I kind of wish it was in the center console because that is really far from the driver. You can see it's right down there by my toes. That's also where we find the 12-volt power port. Lots of room in here. Moving back, we see this very large center console. We have two cup holders up here, two USB charge-only ports, a Qi wireless charging mat. This is really quite deep. The distance from the bottom of this floor up to the bottom of this is nearly a foot. We then have this large armrest that goes all the way back there to between the rear passengers in the rear. This opens to give us even more storage right here or it will lift completely out of the way so you have access to all of this storage area. You could definitely keep purses, large bags, perhaps even a small diaper bag in this area. Definitely a lot of storage, but as I said before, you can see that it ends up pretty close to that rear seat back there, so the rear passengers are kind of divided by that console. Over on the driver's side, we find another 12.3-inch LCD. This is the instrument cluster, and it does have a few different themes available. If I go over here to setup, I can choose whether I want these displays to be black or white, so if you were worried about all that lighter color, don't worry. You can also schedule it so that we will automatically split basically at night. We can then go over and then we can change the theme of that LCD instrument cluster. If I go over here to cluster, select theme, there are 3 different theme choices. The 3 themes are pretty similar. This is theme A, this is theme B, and then the next one is theme C, quite logically. If you so desire, those different themes can be linked to the drive mode selector right over here on the steering wheel. Speaking of the steering wheel, this is a round 2-spoke model, which is kind of an interesting twist. No logo in the middle. I was really surprised by that. In fact, on the inside, there really aren't any Hyundai logos in here because this is sort of the IONIQ sub-brand, so it's a Hyundai, but it's also an IONIQ. Over here, we have some new stocks. This is the headlight switch stock right over there and the turn signal stock. Over here on this side, we have a stock for the windshield wipers, and then this is the gear shift. I press my foot on the brake there, rotate it forward. You can see a little light there for drive, pull all the way back for reverse. P is that button right there. From a driving position, it is very visible, as you can see right there, just in that little area of the steering wheel. The steering wheel itself offers paddles on the back. These are Regen braking paddles, so you can decrease the amount of Regen with this paddle, and then increase the amount of Regen with this paddle over here. We have programmable buttons on the steering wheel. This is a favorite button, but the mode button can also be programmed like a favorite button. Track forward, backward, voice command, volume up, down, etc. And then the buttons on this side relate to that multifunction LCD cluster and the adaptive cruise control system that's standard. This is the aggressive lane centering function button. As with other Hyundai vehicles, the amount of information displayed by that screen is pretty basic. We have our trip computer right there in the middle, turn-by-turn directions, a little bit of information on the all-wheel drive system and tire pressure, and then of course our active safety systems. Now let's get the IONIQ 5 out on the road. From a complete stop, full power comes on right around 35 or 36 miles per hour. That's pretty similar to a wide variety of EVs out there, like the ID4 or the Ford Mustang. In terms of 0 to 60 performance for EVs, the big difference between this and some EVs that are going to be faster, like certain versions of the Tesla Model Y, those vehicles generally ramp power more quickly. The faster you ramp power in an EV like this, the faster your 0 to 60 time is generally going to be. But those quick 0 to 60 times also put extra stress on drivetrain components, and that's why most manufacturers like Hyundai and Ford and Volkswagen choose to ramp things up a little bit more gradually. Now, the thing I hadn't expected with the IONIQ 5 is how much fun this is out on your favorite winding mountain road, because Hyundai chose not to put identical electric motors in the back and in the front. The rear electric motor is bigger than the front electric motor. It's about twice the power output. And that means that even though this can balance power 50-50 front and rear in low speed or in slippery situations, if you put your foot to the metal, it is definitely going to have a strong rear power bias. The rear power bias and the wide tires make the IONIQ 5 a ton of fun to drive out on your favorite winding mountain road. Now, these roadways are a little bit slipperier than I would like, but this is still just a ton of fun to drive. You can get the rear end to kick out just a little bit, but it's still very, very stable. Hyundai has really programmed this stability control system to give you a lot of fun out on your favorite winding mountain road. I would actually say a surprising amount of fun, while still letting you be very, very in control. 0 to 60 time in this model should happen right around 5 seconds or just below. There have been some initial reports out of South Korea in that model that it went 4.9 seconds 0 to 62, so should be right in that range. Obviously, I haven't had this at home to do any official testing. I would expect this to be ever so slightly slower than some versions of the Ford Mustang Mach-E. This is definitely quicker than the Volkswagen ID4, probably going to be slower than the Tesla Model Y. Hyundai has done an excellent job tuning the suspension in the IONIQ 5, and even though they haven't given me an official weight balance figure, I suspect this is pretty close to 50-50, based on the way it feels out here on these winding roads. The other thing that surprised me with the IONIQ 5 is the suspension tune. Hyundai chose not to make this as firm as the Mach-E or the Tesla Model Y. With the Mach-E, Ford was definitely copying Tesla. A lot of big battery EVs that have ranges around 300 miles or so and have sporting pretenses, they tend to be firm and bouncy, and that is not what we find in this, even though we do have those relatively wide 20-inch wheels and tires. So far today, I've been behind the wheel for about 6 hours, and I have to say that the ride quality is probably the most impressive thing for me about the IONIQ 5. It's possible that the extra ground clearance that we find in this versus the Mach-E is one of the reasons that the ride quality is better, but it also appears that the suspension just has more motion available to it. And one of the problems with big battery EVs is that you've got about 5,000 pounds of EV and not too much distance to damp the vehicle's motions in. That limitation is really obvious in electric vehicles that have a sporty mission, like the Tesla Model 3 or the Polestar 2 or the Ford Mustang Mach-E. They again get that firm and bouncy feel. This is the kind of vehicle that I wouldn't mind on a long road trip. This is a lot more comfortable than the Mach-E. The cabin is also very quiet. A problem with a lot of electric vehicles is that without sort of the white noise of the engine and the drivetrain happening in the background, you can focus a bit more on tire noise or wind noise or buzzes of electronic systems in the vehicle. And the electronic systems in the Ford Mustang Mach-E can have a very slight buzz. Personally, it doesn't bug me, but I know it bothers some people. I haven't heard that same thing in the IONIQ 5. And wind noise and tire noise are very well controlled in the IONIQ 5. I would say this is definitely quieter than the base Mustang Mach-E out on the road, even though this has 255 width tires on it rather than 225 width tires that we find on that Mustang. At this point in the day, I have put about 150 miles on the IONIQ 5, and I have split my time driving this aggressively out on fun winding mountain roads and driving it more sedately in town and on the freeway at 65 or 70 miles an hour. Depending on the exact situation that you're driving this on, you should experience fuel economy between about 2.5 miles per kilowatt hour and about 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour. If you're out on level, steady state highway, especially country highway where the speed limits are going to be a little bit lower, you should be right up there around 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour. One thing that really helps out the economy and the range in this is that this does have a heat pump. Now, it is optional. If you don't get all-wheel drive, you don't get the heat pump. And that seems to be pretty logical because folks that are interested in all-wheel drive are probably going to be living in those northern climates. Heat pumps are considerably more efficient than traditional resistive element heaters like the one that we find in the Mach-E. The reason for that is that a heat pump like this isn't creating new heat. It's essentially moving heat from outside to inside the cabin, and that's why heat pumps like this can be 300 or even 400% efficient. So for the amount of power that you put in, you'd get 3 to 4 times the amount of heat out of it versus a Ford Mustang Mach-E's heater. And that means that in those colder climates, you're going to notice less range loss in this. Now, it still has a backup electric resistive element heater for really cold areas or for times where maybe it needs to dehumidify the air. So it can run the air conditioning basically and use that resistive element heater to heat the water in the system as well. It can also use the heat pump to heat or cool the battery pack. This is a completely temperature controlled battery pack. Obviously, you're going to have to wait until I can get this at home for my complete range evaluation, but if you want to know how this charges, be sure and stay tuned because I will have a fast charge video just as soon as I can get this battery down to 10%. That's exactly where I'm headed right now. Bottom line, out on the road for now, the IONIQ 5 is a truly impressive new EV, and I like the fact that Hyundai went in a different direction than a lot of the other big battery EVs that are currently on sale. Ford definitely copied Tesla with the Mach-E, let's be frank. It is a Ford interpretation of what the Model Y customer is interested in. It has a sporty demeanor, it has a rear power bias, it has a front trunk, it's shaped an awful lot like the Model Y, etc. Hyundai went in a different direction with the IONIQ 5, especially when it comes to suspension tuning. This suspension is tuned very well for handling. It definitely does really well out on your favorite winding mountain road, but the center of gravity is going to be a teeny tiny bit higher than something like the Mach-E and GT or GT Performance trims, and it's not going to have that same level of 0 to 60 performance, but I am more than willing to trade all of that for the ride quality that we find in the IONIQ. This is absolutely excellent. I also love these Regen brake paddles. This is something that Hyundai has done in a number of their EVs and plug-in hybrids, and these are absolutely fantastic. If you want the most efficient mode for long-distance travel, you're going to want coasting, which is what it's in right now. The Regen is set to absolute 0. And that's because taking power out of the battery and then regenerating it back into the battery is not a 100% efficient process. This is going to be the most efficient, just coasting. But if you want that one-pedal drive feel, you can engage that as well. Or you can have 2 different levels of regeneration between the two. And the regen braking in this vehicle is incredibly impressive. I do wish that Hyundai would give us a little bit more information about exactly where the power has gone in the IONIQ 5. The screens that I showed you earlier simply show where the power is going now, not cumulatively which systems consume the power for the drive. And that's a screen that I really like in EVs that do that, where they tell you 80% was consumed by the route, X number of percent was consumed by battery heating or cooling, and this percent by heating or cooling the cabin. I think that's really handy because it helps guide you in what can save your range and what can save you energy. Rather unfortunately, on this drizzly day, I don't know how much the IONIQ 5 is going to cost, but I do know it's going to come in 6 different colors. They're all sort of jewel tones or blacks or whites. No red palette is available for the IONIQ 5 at the moment. There are also going to be 3 different interior colors available, and it's going to be available in 3 different trims. The SE trim is going to give you that 303 mile of range. 800 volt DC fast charging is standard, as is the converter to convert 400 volts to 800 volts for those older DC fast charge stations, and the dual 12.3-inch LCD cluster setup, that is standard as well. The next step up is the SEL trim, which adds their latest highway driving assistance software, power tailgate, leatherette seats, and ambient lighting. The limited trim, which is what I've been driving today, has everything: 20-inch wheels, heads-up display, premium audio, the automated parking, etc., and the 360-degree camera system. If everything goes to plan, you will be able to buy the IONIQ 5 this calendar year in 2021. Apparently, there are already several hundred models waiting at the port to be distributed to dealers across the country. At the beginning, the IONIQ 5 is going to be available only in a select number of states, including California, Texas, Florida, and a number of other EV-friendly states, but that is going to be expanding to the entire United States sometime in 2023, we're told. By the time you're watching this video, Hyundai has promised me that pricing will be available, so let's move to the studio and talk about that now. In addition to the surprise of the standard range SE trim actually happening in the United States, Hyundai didn't tell anybody pricing when we were driving the vehicles. So let's go through the pricing right now. It turns out that the base model, that's going to be the 168 horsepower model with 220 miles of range, that's going to set you back $39,700. It is going to qualify for the full $7,500 federal tax credit, however. And because Hyundai hasn't sold as many EVs or plug-in hybrids as a number of the competitors out there, that full tax credit is expected to last several years with Hyundai. So you shouldn't have any problem getting a 2022 or even a 2023 IONIQ 5 with the complete federal tax credit. After that, every other trim is going to come in your choice of rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive with the same power level: 225 horsepower rear-wheel drive, 320 horsepower all-wheel drive. And remember, the all-wheel drive package comes with the heat pump and a few other doodads here and there in the cabin. The base SE long-range trim, which is going to give you 303 miles and 225 horsepower, is going to start at $43,650. All-wheel drive adds $3,500 there. The SEL trim is $45,900. I think that's a good middle ground for the IONIQ 5. The limited trim starts at $50,600, and then of course you can add the all-wheel drive onto that model as well. Overall, the IONIQ 5 ends up being surprisingly well priced. It's pretty much right between the Mach-E for 2022 and the Volkswagen ID.4. Ford's Mach-E recently had a pretty significant price bump. Prices went up $1,000 to $3,000 across the board. Let's talk about how it compares just very briefly here. The Mach-E now starts at $43,895. That is definitely more expensive than the IONIQ 5, but it will give you more horsepower and a little bit more range, 230 miles of range in that model. The most significant difference is, of course, going to be the base horsepower. All-wheel drive is $2,700 extra in the Ford, logically because it doesn't come with the heat pump technology that we find in the IONIQ 5. Comparing comparable model to comparable model, the IONIQ 5 is going to be $4,000 to $5,000 less expensive than the Mustang Mach-E. But the power levels don't quite correlate directly. There are going to be versions of the Mach-E that are going to be quicker, especially the base version is pretty swift for the Ford, and there are going to be versions of the IONIQ 5 that are a little bit faster than the corresponding Mustang, especially for the same price range here. You also have a few choices to make. For instance, you could get an all-wheel drive limited with the 320 horsepower and swift 0 to 60 time for about the price, or actually less than the price, of a rear-wheel drive premium trim big battery Mach-E that's going to go slower 0 to 60 and only be rear-wheel drive. On the slightly less expensive end of things, we have the Volkswagen ID.4. Volkswagen was really aggressive with pricing with this model, starts at $39,995 and gives you 260 miles of range, 3 years of free DC fast charging as well. The base model of the ID.4 isn't exactly swift, but neither is the 168 horsepower IONIQ 5 going to be either. The IONIQ 5 ends up being about $3,500 more than the base all-wheel drive version of the ID.4. So the ID.4 is still a really good deal, even if you add the relatively expensive all-wheel drive option on that model. It adds $3,680 to the base price and drops range down to 249 miles of range. Now, comparably, you will get faster charging in the IONIQ 5, you'll get the heat pump, you'll get a much better infotainment system, but you will be paying about $3,500 more. Hopefully over the next month or so, we'll be able to get the IONIQ 5 in for a full weekly review and, of course, our official range figures. But on the surface of things, the IONIQ 5 appears to be very efficient. It handles well. It's very comfortable, which really I think was the most surprising thing about the IONIQ 5. For me, at any rate, it is definitely significantly more comfortable in terms of the ride quality than the Mustang Mach-E. Be sure to let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you pick if you were shopping for a mainstream EV among these three vehicles that I've talked about? Would you get the Ford Mustang Mach-E, which does a really good Tesla impersonation for a lower starting price? Would you get the Volkswagen ID.4, which is trying to be the Volkswagen Tiguan of EVs? Or would you get the IONIQ 5, which is sort of marching to a different drummer, but also trying to say that it is an alternative to a RAV4 or a CR-V? Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, and of course stay tuned because I will have my hands on it for a full weekly review just as soon as I can.